Well, hello, class. Welcome to chapter 13, one of my favorite chapters in the entire book. I'm so excited about teaching you about one of my favorite topics, social psychology. You're going to find so much in this chapter that is foundational and conceptual when it comes to understanding psychology overall. I hope that there's lots of concepts that give you curiosity and insight and self-reflection and information about why people do the things they do. Your job today is to settle in and start dreaming big. Before we begin, I have a question for you. What do you think about when I say the word hero? What sensations or images or thoughts or feelings come across your person when you think of a hero? Who is your favorite fictional hero? Is it Katniss Everdeen? Is it Wonder Woman? Is it Harry Potter? Is it Mulan? Batman, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Bilbo Baggins, Veronica Mars, Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Who's your favorite hero? What makes them special? What makes them courageous? What makes them do the right thing? What about Eleven from Stranger Things, or Clark Griffin from The 100, or Doctor Strange? What about Star-Lord, or Gamora, or Groot? As I record this lecture today, I'm looking at my bulletin board, and I'm seeing a picture of Chapman University, and then I have something posted right next to it that says, "Be part of something greater." As you listen to this lecture, and as you think of the characteristics of your favorite hero, I want you to listen to this material not just as another lecture and another thing that you have to do in a busy week. I want you to think about it as information that makes you courageous and it allows you to be part of something greater. All of the heroes that I've just listed came from really hard things and worked through it despite overwhelming odds to save others, redeem others, do good things. And I want that for you too. So in this lecture today, let's be heroic. Let's listen to the things that make us us and also help us understand why we do the things we do. If we can understand that, then perhaps our hero's journey can move forward a little bit more effectively. Let's get started. Social psychology examines how people affect one another, and it looks at the power of the situation. Social psychologists assert that an individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are very much influenced by social situations and vice versa. Essentially, people will change their behavior to align with the social situation. And also, once people are in a social situation, the social situation itself changes. Sometimes if we're new to a situation or even unsure how to behave, we take our cues and look around to see what other people are doing, right? So the field of social psychology studies topics both at the intrapersonal level, that's inside, and interpersonal level, that's between people. Intrapersonal topics, the stuff that is within you, has to do with emotions and attitudes, self and self-understanding, and social cognition, which is how we think about ourselves and others. Interpersonal topics, those things that correspond to between people, include helping, compassion, altruism, aggression, prejudice, discrimination, attraction and love and liking, intimacy, and intergroup relationships, stuff that's like conflict or cooperation. So all in all, this chapter is going to walk us through how social psychology studies individuals inside of a social context and how those situational variables interact intra and interpersonally to influence affect, behavior, and cognition. So in this chapter, we're going to discuss social cognition, or how we think about ourselves and others when we're in a group. social behavior, stuff like conformity and obedience, social influence, or how we persuade or manipulate or teach others, intergroup relations that has to do with helping and hurting, cooperation and conflict, close relationships, stuff like liking and attraction and love. And by the end of the chapter, hopefully we'll have some insights about how we take this research and apply it to personal places to have better health and better wellness. So here's your job in this lecture. Every time we go through a concept, I want you to either connect it with your hero and their story, or connect it with an example from your own life or something that you've experienced or something that you've seen. This material will be a lot easier to understand if you can come up with vivid personal examples, okay? So try that really hard, and sometimes you might have to listen to a slide and then pause it for a second and be like, okay, what's an example of this concept? If you do that, I think you'll walk away with a fuller understanding of the awesome research in social psychology. Let's get started. Okay, so we discussed already that social psychology is the study of how people essentially think about, influence, and relate to one another. That has to do with affect, behavior, and cognition. We also know that the big question in psychology is, why do people do what they do? And hopefully over the length of this course you've realized that it's not easy to study on a scientific, precise way exactly how to do that, because people are complicated and beautiful and unpredictable. We're also multifaceted. Sometimes we want to do something, but we do the opposite, and it's like, what? We're also humans and not robots, which means that we make mistakes and we sometimes don't understand something, or we sometimes behave differently than we hoped that we would. Social psychology absolutely has a heart for those things. Social psychology is a field of psychology that wants to know about how we think about social settings and social groupings and our social selves, social cognition. Social influence, which has to do with what we do and how we influence one another once we're together. So that's conformity and obedience and persuasion and all those processes that involve group behavior. And also social relationships, which have to do with stuff like love, liking, and the opposite, hatred and discord. Throughout this class, you've seen different levels of analysis. We've studied the question, why do people do what they do, on multiple levels, right? We've started with the small building block pieces, the cellular pieces, the neurons of who you are, brain and behavior. We got bigger and bigger as we talked more about perception, sensation, and processing. And then we started learning about rewards and punishments and reinforcements. And then we got a little bit bigger talking about learning and memory, cognition and intelligence. And then we talked about your development and your early experiences from conception through the lifespan, of how those early experiences form and are formed as you move through life. In our last chapter, we talked about some of the places that are consistently you on the inside, the constellation of your affect, behavior, and cognition, characteristic across situations and relative to other people. So in this chapter, we get as big as we can, given all the other things that we've discussed in this class, given all the different levels of analysis. We can now talk at a bigger level, a more macro level, about why you do what you do. And since we're in psychology, which is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, we're going to answer that question really at an individual level. How does an individual in a social world decide what they do and how they feel and how they interact with others? So let's start with a story. And this is a almost like a parable, actually. And I'm going to tell you this story. I'm going to tell you its influence on social psychology, and then give you a little bit of the messier human picture of it. So in 1964, there was a young woman. She was 28 years old. Her name was Catherine Genovese, or Kitty. She was a bartender in New York City. Sounds like she was artistic and smart and creative and different and really cool. She was coming home from work one night and was attacked by a stranger that stabbed her in the alleyway close to her apartment building. Where she was attacked, there were over 38 neighbors nearby that could have come to her rescue or could have intervened. In the attack, she cried for help, but no one came for help. So her attacker stabbed her and punctured her lung, and then actually ran off because he was afraid of getting caught. Unfortunately, no one came to help her, so the attacker came back, and the attack lasted over 30 minutes. Unfortunately, she died without anyone intervening to help her. Now, the news at the time reported that those 38 people, they were totally callous. They didn't care. New Yorkers don't care. People don't care. Look at the world. You've got 38 people and nobody called the police. It was highly publicized, and it's part of the reason that it's in every psychology textbook I've ever read. Kitty's life and death have led to essentially the development of studying something called the bystander effect, or bystander intervention. Why didn't these people help her? Now, to be fair to the neighbors, although it was reported at the time that these people heard the attack and they did nothing and they didn't intervene, isn't that terrible? It sounds like the situation in all analysis was actually a little less clear, a little more ambiguous than that. Many of the neighbors didn't quite know what was going on, or thought that it was a quote-unquote lover's quarrel, or that maybe someone was drunk outside. It was also really late, so it was 3 a.m, and not everyone had a full awareness of what was happening. I do believe that some people did call the police at the tail end of the attack. But this doesn't change how important the story was to the movement of social psychology. A real-life example like this really set off a lot of questions about human nature. Why didn't anybody help? How can we get people to intervene the next time something like this happens? What's wrong with us that we didn't intervene or help her earlier? Following this, a lot of research was done on the bystander effect. And despite the fact that the real-life situation sounds like it was more ambiguous, more difficult, and more complex than it was originally reported, we do know that there are some concepts here that have been studied scientifically. Those concepts lead us to understand that sometimes we actually don't help as quickly or directly as we would like to think that we would in certain situations. In the late 60s, Darley and Latané did a lot of studies, not just one, but many studies on the bystander effect. And what they found is that, believe it or not, the more people that are around an emergency situation, the less likely it is that help or action takes place. So this means that if you are in distress and you are in the library, you are more likely to get help from someone if it's just you and another person sitting at a table than if it's you and 100 people in the library at the same time. Provocative, right? Oh my gosh. Why would that happen? That doesn't even make any sense. Very consistently, what happens in emergency situations is there's often 2 reasons why people are less likely to help when there's a big group around. The first reason for that is conformity. Oftentimes what happens in an emergency situation is if there's 99 other people in the library not doing anything, I, as another bystander, might look around and conform to the non-action of other people. Because if all these other people aren't doing anything, maybe I'm just overreacting, or maybe everything must be fine, I guess, right? A second reason that we might not act has to do with the diffusion of responsibility. And that has to do with the fact that if there's a lot of us around, somebody will help, right? So sometimes what happens in an emergency situation is that we assume other people have either already called 911 or someone's more qualified to do it or somebody else will step up. But the research shows us, you guys, that that's not what happens. The more people that don't act, the less likely it is that anyone's going to decide to act. So if you walk away with even one insight from my entire class, I want you to listen to this, and I want you to listen to this with your whole heart. If you're ever in an emergency situation, someone's injured, someone's possibly injured, something's not safe, something doesn't look or feel right, just go ahead and call. Call 911, call for help, ask the person out loud if they need help. Don't assume that other people are going to do it better. Don't assume that other people are going to call. Don't assume that everything's okay and they'll just deal with it. Go ahead and just use your person, use your words, use your confidence, do the right thing and act. If you're helping within your talent and within your safety and within your boundaries, you're not diving in and doing surgery on someone right there, right? That's outside of your duties. That's not your job. But if you are helping or calling 911 or asking those kids, hey, are you guys safe? Are you okay? What's going on here? The very worst that could happen when you are within your boundary is that maybe you'll be a little embarrassed because they don't need your help. Well, trust me, a little bit of embarrassment is small, very small in comparison to missing an opportunity to help someone that was in distress. See something, say something, okay? Okay, moving forward, as you'll remember, social psychology involves three main things about how people think about the world. It involves social thinking, social influence, and social relationships. So let's talk a little bit about social thinking or social cognition. Social cognition is how people select, interpret, remember, and use social information to make decisions about behavior and mental processes. Now, I know that sounds a little complicated, but let's just parse it down to this. Social cognition is how you think about yourself and others while in a social world, and how that thinking about the world influences your behavior and mental processes and behavior and mental processes as you engage in that social world. So let's talk about some basic insights. The first one that we want to talk about is person perception, or how you perceive other people. There's a lot of research that has to do with the primacy and the importance of the face. The face is a special class of stimuli. That's why sometimes when you look at the moon or you're driving and you see the rocks as you drive by, sort of mountains and rocks, where you'll sort of see faces in things that are not faces, your brain is ready. It's one of the most important stimuli. You come to the world ready to sort of discern those shapes. It's a very important stimuli, so it's no mistaking that we value and search for and put priority on the face. In regard to the face, it seems to be the case that we like pretty faces. We like attractive faces. We put value on things that are beautiful. So what's beautiful? Well, the research shows us that faces are often valued at a higher level or seen as more attractive when they are more average. And what do you mean by average? Well, they do these studies where they do composite faces, where they sort of overlay many faces on top of one another. Composite or average face averages out or rounds out some of the individual features from the extremes of people. So average faces that are symmetrical are often viewed as beautiful. We also know that there are things that are viewed as beautiful as well, and that has to do with anything that evokes youthfulness or healthiness. So healthy skin, big eyes, big lips. A lot of the filters and a lot of the face apps and Facetune and Photoshop, what it does is if there's an imperfection or I've got something on my face, we can just erase it, right? Another thing that people often see as beautiful has to do with youthful characteristics. So that's what the science says. So where's the social in all of that? Well, the social in all of that has to do with something called the halo effect. And the halo effect is this beautiful is good stereotype. People that are seen as beautiful get a benefit socially in the sense that other people perceive them to be beautiful, yes. But because they're beautiful, they get this extra benefit of being seen as trustworthy and smart and generous and funny and all those attractive and good and yay, I want to be with this person sort of characteristics. I want to help this person. I want them to like me. That beautiful is good stereotype leads to a halo in the sense that we see beautiful as being an indication that that person also has beautiful characteristics across the board. So oftentimes beautiful people can be treated better than people that are viewed as less attractive. So what are the social psychological implications here? Well, essentially, this halo effect often leads to something called self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-fulfilling prophecy is what happens when the expectation in the mind and heart of one person, we'll call that person A, when person A has a positive expectation for person B, that's going to be our beautiful person, and that person B is across from me, right? The positive expectation in person A, so person A comes in with this halo effect. They come in with the, okay, beautiful people are often smart, they're often generous, they're often really nice. You know, I want to be around beautiful people. I want beautiful people to like me. Okay, that's kind of what I'm walking in with, person A. When I walk in and I engage with person B, let's call person B the beautiful person, my expectation on the inside of who I am can go across to person B, whether I say it, whether I act about it, whether I smile more, I look at their eyes more, I give them more attention, I invite them out more, I ask them about their life more, right? There's things that I'm doing because I walk in with the expectation that actually change the behavior of person B. So if person B has all these positive vibes coming at them, right? These happy expectations, kind questions, good nonverbals, smiling, laughing, telling jokes, being likable. If I'm doing all that towards them, person A is sending that over. Person B oftentimes will respond in kind. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy in such a way as the expectation in the mind of one person, person A, gets non-verbally sent across the way to person B. That is my expectation is being sent over to person B. And person B behaves in such a way as they behave in kind with that expectation. So when person B therefore behaves in a kind, likable, smart, awesome manner, they behaviorally confirm for me that my positive expectation was correct, therefore allowing me to strengthen my positive expectation and continue the cycle where my expectations go to person B. Person B fulfills those expectations, and when they do, it gets sent back to me, and I go, oh yeah, I was right. They are so smart and so awesome. Oh my gosh. So beautiful people get a benefit of positive expectation, but also that positive expectation has an impact on their behavior. And that is self-fulfilling prophecy. In one of the most classic studies of self-fulfilling prophecy, we have Rosenthal and Jacobson's 1968 study about bloomers. In this study, what they did is They were dealing with elementary school students. And they told teachers, okay, hey, we've done testing on your students, and we've identified several students in your classroom that, according to our tests, show us that they're just going to be bloomers. They're going to bloom over the length of this school year. They're going to show tremendous growth academically this school year. What the teachers didn't know is those students were chosen randomly. But what was found is, despite those students being chosen at random, that expectation actually produced the outcome that was expected, in such a way as the students that were expected to bloom had higher IQ scores, higher test scores at the end of the school year than their non-blooming counterparts. This means essentially that something that the teacher did, person A, right? Their expectation, the smiling, the engagement, the asking questions, touch, handshakes, high fives, crouching down and being like, hey, Johnny, let me help you with that. Let me give you some more time, right? That the one-on-one stuff, the positive expectation, actually was sent across to that kid in such a way as the kid was like, yeah, I'm struggling with this concept, but I think I'm going to try a little bit harder because, my teacher is smiling at me a lot and she believes in me. Okay, let's keep going. That is the self-fulfilling prophecy or expectancy effect. We talked in the last chapter about how important it was for psychological health to have a personality that has positive expectations for the future. It was one of the last things that we talked about in chapter 12. Well, this is so important again in social situations. What you expect about other people, you often find in them. And you might even create in them. So what's the application here? Check your heart when you're engaging with people that maybe that you don't like or you don't expect it to go very well. We all have people in our life sometimes that when we interact with them, we're like, uh-oh, this is going to be difficult, right? I mean, I do. I'm sure you do too, right? So something that's really important from the literature here is that sometimes if I walk in with a negative expectation of a social situation, if I walk in and I go no one's going to like me, they're all going to be mean to me. That girl doesn't really like me. She was mean to me last time. If I walk in already on the defensive or I walk in already negative in tone, a lot of times I get what I expect because I'm sending it over to other people. And oftentimes other people are just kind of responding in kind. I smile at you, you smile back. I mad dog you or look away or I'm on my phone. The person across the way does the same thing as well. Now, that doesn't mean that other people are just out there just waiting to mirror what you do. It just means that you do play a role in the social situations and the outcome of the social situations in which you are placed. Another way in which person perception comes to the forefront is this idea of first impressions or gut responses. Now, there's a lot of research on first impressions. And believe it or not, first impressions or gut instinct or that quick blink response is not as inaccurate as some people think it's going to be. Sometimes the more you think over something, the more convoluted or complicated it can be. I'll give you an example. So when people that have art history backgrounds and great knowledge of art history, when they are asked to look at fakes and authentic paintings, sort of to assess whether something's a fake or a real piece of art, the real deal. This happens to you too. You ever take a test and essentially you had the right answer, but you thought about it so much you made it into something that it actually wasn't and twisted it and oh shoot, you got that one wrong. This is not saying that your first impressions are perfect. They are far from perfect. It just means that sometimes on some things, first impressions might be more accurate than you think. There's a whole body of psychological research, even involving Rosenthal from that study that I just told you about, the Bloomer study. Rosenthal did a lot of studies that involve something called thin slices. These are very brief and short displays of a human face or a human interaction. Well, people are actually pretty good at discerning pretty quickly which emotion other people are experiencing or what the dynamic is within very, very short, less than a second slices, thin slices of display. Now, maybe that's not very provocative to you, or maybe you're not shocked by that. But definitely that was surprising in psychology at some point to realize that people were making those decisions at a pretty good level pretty quickly. Now, although first impressions can be accurate, they're not always accurate. So another part of this person perception puzzle is that first impressions, accurate or not, tend to be the ones that carry a lot of power for us. They fall underneath something we saw in the memory chapter, and that's that primacy effect. That the first information that comes in about something has more remembrance in my system. So there absolutely is, according to the literature and social psychology, a scientific finding that first impressions and the strength of those impressions, it does exist, it is a thing, and people do hold on to those first impressions as being of more primary importance. And I think that that kind of connects also with self-fulfilling prophecy too, right? So if in a first impression I come across really cheerful and really fun-loving, then when you interact with me the next time, you walk in with this expectation, right? So that first impression might actually help create second impressions because we've started this kind of back and forth role of you expecting from me and me behaving towards it or behaving to confirm it, and that's strengthening your expectation, and you send it back over to me and we dance back and forth in these expectations and confirmations and expectations and confirmations. So you might ask yourself, oh my gosh, how do you get out of this loop? What happens if it's a first interview and you screw up the interview? Well, listen, guys, you're human. No one makes perfect impressions all the time. I don't have enough video or enough time in a lecture to tell you the amount of stories and things in my life that have been bad first impressions, because I'm a human and so are you. So you're not a captive to every first impression. That person's expectation of you, it can change when you give them data to show them that it can change. So if they don't expect you to be kind, but you're kind, it doesn't mean that they believe it the first time. They might even interpret your kindness as like sarcasm or, oh, she's just being patronizing, right? But if you're consistently kind, at some point with most people, most reasonable people, you'll be able to circle back around and get those expectations back where they need to be. So what would your favorite hero do when they're not expected to succeed? They wouldn't give up, right? They would just buckle down and keep trying, right? Okay, another really big part of social cognition has to do with a concept that we call attribution. And I think the best way to understand this concept is to replace attribution with explanation. An attribution is an explanation for why people do what they do. It is a process by which we come to understand the causes of other people's behavior and form an impression or create an explanation of why they did their behavior. Why? What was the motive? Where did it come from? What was the cause? Why would a person do that? Why would a person do that action? Why would they behave in that way? Attribution's at the heart of our big question in psychology. Why do people do what they do? Why do I do what I do? Why do you do what you do? Why did that thing happen? Why did that other thing happen? Right? So part of being human is looking for attributional causes to understand ourselves and others. Why did that behavior or action happen? Now, there's two broad ways of answering that question. One, a person might answer it in regard to a disposition, or two, a person might answer it in regard to a situation or a context. Let's imagine that my friend Caitlin is not responding to my texts as quickly or as enthusiastically as she used to. A dispositional explanation for that behavior. So I have a behavior. She's not interacting with me the same way. She's not responding as quickly, or she's not responding with as much back and forth. That's the behavior that I want to know why. Why is that happening? Why is that action or behavior happening? What's the cause? A dispositional answer to that would be, well, she must not like me, or she must be mad at me, or, right? Do you see what I'm saying? There's something about her. She must be being rude or mean. I'm putting it on Caitlin, right? I'm putting it on something that she's processing. It's a disposition. It's something about her. That same situation underneath a situational attribution might be, she's a social worker in a hospital during a time that's extremely, extremely difficult, right? So the answer to why is she not responding is that she's busy. It has nothing to do with her disposition. It has nothing to do with her being nice or not nice, friend or not friend. It has everything to do with what a crazy season of work it is for her right now. Disposition or situation. So you can see it in the example of this slide as well. You can see these two pictures. So we have a behavior. We have the person on the right is late with turning in a report. So we have a coworker saying she's late with her report because she can't concentrate on her own responsibilities, meaning that that person that's late with the report is lazy or unfocused. That's a dispositional attribution. But maybe the person that's late with the report is in a situation or a season in the work life where other people keep interrupting her with other projects and other emergencies, and it's pushing back that report because other really big things have come up. That's the situational attribution. It's the situation that's doing it. So what the fundamental attribution error is essentially is that people will very often give dispositional attributions when they are trying to describe the behavior of other people. People often overestimate the dispositional causes of other people's behavior. What does this mean? This means that when we are trying to describe the behavior of someone else, we're more likely to describe it or explain it by way of disposition. So your friend got a paper back and the paper grade wasn't very good. You're more likely to describe the cause for that paper grade as dispositional to her. You know, she always waits until the last minute. She's such a procrastinator. She's always late, you know. You're explaining her behavior as something that's inside of her. It's an internal cause. It's something about her. Unfortunately, we sometimes, when we're looking at the behavior of other people, we underestimate the situational causes that are going on in their life at that time. So it might not be that she procrastinated. It might be that the paper was very hard. So there might be situational causes that actually better explain the behavior that we see. What's the takeaway there? The takeaway there is that very commonly, especially in Western societies, people will make this fundamental attribution error when describing the reason for the behavior or the causes of the behavior of another person's actions. We only do this with explaining or giving attributions for the behavior of other people. Because when we explain our own behaviors, when we're trying to give the reason of why Bryn did what she did, we tend to explain our behavior in terms of situational causes or external causes. So when I turn in the paper, I'm inside of the situation, so I know the situational causes that were around me at the time of doing that assignment, that paper assignment. And in line with some of our attribution errors, there's another one that we have called the false consensus effect. And the false consensus effect has to do with us overestimating how much other people think or act the way that we do. We tend to overestimate people agreeing with us or seeing the world the same way that we do. If we've behaved a way, we assume that other people would have done the same thing. We overestimate what we think other people also think. What's an example of this? Well, maybe you've been in a group situation, or you've had to do a group project, or you've just been with a group of people. And you're sitting there and you're listening to the lecture, you're listening to the assignment, and you're thinking maybe all these thoughts about here's what we should do and here's what we shouldn't do. You might have ideas, right? A lot of times in a group setting, we sometimes overestimate how much other people have those same ideas. It's always kind of surprising, too, once you start actually talking one-on-one, where you realize, oh, people at this table right now in this group actually disagree about what we should do. How interesting. So one of the things that punctures false consensus is open dialogue and open, diverse communication. Because once you're engaging with somebody, especially cooperatively, when you're working on a cooperative task, you realize very quickly that not everybody sees the world or that group assignment in the same way. Let's talk about a few of the other things that have to do with social thinking. Now, social thinking involves how you think of other people, but also how you think of yourself. And the self is special in the sense that you know more about yourself than others. You've been there. You've been in all the situations. You've been through it with yourself. You have more information. But because you know more, you also have a stronger emphasis and a stronger need to maintain a good sense of self and a good self-esteem. And it's not easy, right? All humans have a psychological drive to maintain a positive self-esteem. They will do so many things in order to maintain or lift that self-esteem. And that is foundationally human. That's not just you. It's not a weakness or a narcissism in you. I'm not saying that. It's all of us. We all have a set point that does not want to feel bad about who we are. And because feeling bad about who we are doesn't feel good, many people will inflate their self-esteem with some positive illusions or views of themselves that are not necessarily rooted in reality. So positive illusions are one way that a person might be able to distort that discomfort and place it and inflate it by making themselves feel a little bit better. Now, although most people maintain somewhat positive illusions of themselves, we do know that other people are very hard on themselves and have like negative illusions where they don't give themselves the benefit of the doubt and they are not focused in reality. So on either way, you guys, whether there's a positive illusion or a negative illusion, reality testing is the cool place that we all equalize at. So many people, especially when you give them surveys of themselves across decades of research in social psychology, most people have a lot of positive illusions of themselves. They will rate themselves better than average on most characteristics. I believe myself to be a good driver. You have below average, average, and above average as your options. You know that like basically 90% of people circle above average. And that's not the only thing that people often rank themselves above average on. So when we say positive illusions, what I'm trying to say is that the data shows us that most people view themselves as above average on most things. So if you have a negative illusion, or if you're the rare person that's answering below average on stuff, you've got tests and you've got stuff coming up, and some of those negative thoughts might be telling you all these sort of things to worry about, right? Well, let's do some reality testing. The last time that you really worried about a grade, how did the grade come out? Did it come out okay? What was the reality of the situation? Most of the time, those negative illusions just need to be reminded about what the reality of the past experiences are. What is really happening in reality? So whether overinflating how great you are or underinflating how you are, positive illusions are the more likely social thinking strategy, according to the research. Now, another social cognitive concept that is found consistently in the literature is something called the self-serving bias. Most people assume essentially that they're right and that they're above average and that they're not wrong in how they're thinking. And they will often show a self-serving bias, especially in making attributions for themselves, essentially with a preference for seeing successes as being dispositional and internal, and seeing failures as being situational or external. This means essentially that most people have a tendency to take credit for their success as being something that's awesome about them. That is a self-serving bias. And they'll often, with failures, protect their self-esteem by way of denying that they are responsible for those failures by explaining it away with situational attributions. Now, a reminder, we're talking about most people. You guys are really awesome students, and awesome students often have a very internal locus of control. They have a lot of personal responsibility and a lot of self-focus and a lot of self-critique to keep themselves succeeding and moving forward. We're just saying that a lot of times a person will do whatever they need to do to try to defend their self-worth and self-esteem. And the self-serving bias is one way that a person could maintain a positive self-esteem, by taking credit for their successes and by dismissing their failures as externally caused. Another thing that we talk about in social cognition has to do with self-objectification. And objectification is the tendency to see oneself as an object in the eyes of other people. Self-objectification is actually really bad for social thinking, and it's really bad for performance and health overall. People that see themselves as objects have a much easier time allowing other people to use them as such. In one study in your textbook, it talks about how they had girls come into a lab, and some of the girls just took an exam, no big deal. The other girls wore a swimsuit first. They were put into a swimsuit and sort of primed, and the girls that had been placed in the swimsuit performed at a lower level. So what does this tell you about your time on social media? There's a lot of research that shows some dangerous effects of excessive screen time or excessive social media use, in such a way as people that have a lot of screen time and a lot of social media time, like they're on it all the time, show higher levels of depression and anxiety. I think part of the reason for that is that people that are on social media a lot often feel like they have to create an avatar or a brand for themselves, where they have to post the perfect picture or the funniest thing, or they have to get likes, and in order to do that, they have to sort of filter this or that. In a lot of ways, the people that spend the most time on social media and the most time crafting their social media presence, they view themselves as like an object. they're not enjoying the concert. They're trying to take pictures of themselves at the concert so that they can post the pictures to Instagram. They're trying to Snapchat while they're at the concert, not for the enjoyment of the actual concert, but because they're there, and them being there has status, and it's just this weird convoluted thing that happens when people spend a lot of time branding themselves or a lot of time glorifying or objectifying themselves. So here's what the data says, guys. Don't objectify yourself or others. Personalize yourself and others. And do things that personalize you. Do things that personalize others. You'll make better decisions and be happier if you do. And I think that those findings about social media talk a lot about or have connections to social comparison. So social comparison, just so you know, it's not a bad thing to have the feedback from other people about kind of where you're at. We watch our abilities and the abilities and actions of other people to know where we're at in relation to other people. This gives us information about ourselves and others, social thinking. That social comparison is very important to you developing a sense of identity and a sense of self in regard to who you are and what your gifts are and what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. A problem, however, with excessive social comparison, and this is something that happens if you're on social media all day, every day, a constant, steady diet of social comparison, is it can kind of either go one way or the other. If you are comparing yourself with people that are way above you, oftentimes what you can feel is a sense of jealousy or resentment or envy eventually. If everybody else has perfect lives and they're just relaxing so much on their vacation and this is so amazing and their life is so easy and they have all the things, whatever it looks like, right? That upward comparison can result in a sense of resentment, envy, or jealousy. If it's excessive, right? So you might see an inspirational post and sort of be like, yeah, that'd be cool to be that way one day, where it's inspirational. But if you spend 10 hours looking at it, it's a little different than just being inspired and then moving on to the next thing. So that upward comparison that leads to envy and jealousy and resentment can happen if that social media and constant social comparison is the excessive amount of time that you're spending in your day. But then at the same time, the same social media will also have some downward comparisons or places that I feel superior to other people, where I'm looking down. And that downward comparison means that instead of resentment or envy, I'm feeling pride. I'm feeling contempt. I'm feeling superior. So whether it's upward by way of envy or downward by way of pride, excessive social comparison is not good for your person. So consider it a little freebie from Professor Bryn to you. If you are spending all day, every day on social media, it's time to do yourself and others a favor and put some limits on some of that stuff, okay? You'll be happier and less anxious if you do. Okay, so let's move forward and talk about another facet of your social psychology, and that has to do with attitudes. Okay, so attitudes are essentially beliefs about people, places, and ideas. And it is your feelings also about those people, places, and ideas. I like to think that attitudes are like affect and cognition. It's how you feel and how you think about something. Well, we all know that our attitudes or our feelings on something don't perfectly predict our behavior. You might feel like recycling, but not always do it, right? You might feel like getting a good night's sleep or believe that sleep is a good thing, but stay up until 3 a.m. watching YouTube videos. Sometimes we feel and think in a direction that our behavior doesn't go in. It's frustrating. It's every human philosopher and people in scripture and across the world have wrestled with this idea of why are we not as consistent as we want to be? So let's talk about when we are consistent. Like, what are the factors, according to the psychological literature, that allow us to be more consistent between our attitudes and our actual actions or behaviors? Well, we're often more consistent when that attitude is very strongly felt and very strong. Now, remember, I'm not saying that you're perfectly accurate. I'm saying that it's more likely for you to be consistent between attitude and behavior when that attitude is something that is very strongly felt. So I'm more likely to donate to the animal shelter if my love for animals is very strongly felt. If that attitude and that caregiving and caring about the animals in my community, if that attitude is really strong, I'm more likely to behave towards it than maybe something that I care about, but I don't care about as much. This is why sometimes it's really hard to study for a class or hard to do something that you're not looking forward to doing. You don't have like a strong attitude towards it. It's sort of like a meh. And so it's hard to behave towards it. It's hard to dive into the textbook, hard to do the things on the stuff that you don't feel strongly about. So the growth mindset says that on some stuff, I have to find the challenge, or I have to find the big picture. I have to find the personal connection with it in order to motivate it towards my behavior. So if you're studying for a class right now that you're just not feeling, why don't you find something, like something inside of it? There's got to be something, you guys, that you are curious about or interested about or passionate about, or some goal that you can set for yourself to make it something that you feel a little bit stronger towards. Another place that attitudes will more likely predict behavior, not perfectly, but more likely, is when those attitudes are well integrated and well rehearsed and well known. When you have insight and connection and remembrance and depth, when they've been learned and remembered, when they are deeper and more accessible and more well integrated into your system, both personally and perceptually, you're more likely to behave towards that thing. Now, I have a question for you. How easy is it to start a new habit? Not very easy, right? Do you start a new habit and then boom, it's perfect, it's totally in place, you never waver ever again? No, that's usually not the case either. Habits become that way because there's the time. You've got to put the time in. So if any of you are trying to find new habits and find new grounding, then we're in this together, guys. It's okay. It's going to take some time. Give yourself some grace for that. Another place that attitudes are more likely to predict behavior or be consistent with behavior is when the person has something at stake, personally at stake. They have an interest in what that is, in what that behavior is, what the outcome is. So you studying for someone else's test would have less at stake, right? Than you studying for your own test that you're going to get your own grade on, right? But is the opposite true? Can your behavior and your actions actually predict or influence how you feel and think about something? Absolutely. Your personality is a constellation of consistent affect, behavior, and cognitive patterns. Well, isn't it interesting that we're seeing these things, these same elements at play in your social life, in your social thinking? And there's two ways in which that behavior can influence the other elements of who you are that we're going to talk about: cognitive dissonance and self-perception. Okay, let's talk about a topic called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the physical and emotional discomfort that takes place when I have two opposing sort of attitudes or outcomes or thoughts about a situation. Along with that discomfort, I have an internal motivation to diminish that dissonance and resolve that tension. And this cognitive dissonance takes place after I've behaved in a certain way. And after I've behaved in a certain way, I now have thoughts about it. I have thoughts about what I just saw myself do. And I have my own attitudes or my beliefs and thoughts about that thing in the first place. In the 1950s, a researcher by the name of Leon Festinger did a classic experiment. This is Festinger and Carl Smith's boring task experiment. And what they did is they had students come into a lab, and in the lab, they did this very boring task, like tremendously boring task. They had the participants come in and take these little spools, these little wooden shapes. They had to turn the little knobs like a quarter turn, and it was tedious and boring, and it took a long time. And after they did all the board, they like rotated the board around and had them do it again. So like long and boring, okay? So that's the baseline. That's the total baseline task. Everyone does that task in the experiment. The control group at the end of the experiment, after doing all the little spools and moving all the boring task items, doot, doot, doot. After doing that, the control group just gets asked, how fun do you think that was? How did you enjoy it? And they give a rating, which is not great because it was boring, okay? And then you have two other groups. You have a group of people that are going to get $1 for being compensated for telling the next person that comes into the experiment that the experiment was really fun. Or there's a $20 group, and those people are going to receive $20 for telling the next participant that's waiting that the experiment was really fun. Was the experiment fun? No, right? Like, no. Like, in all of the groups, the control, the $1 and the $20, this is not a fun task. It was boring, like legitimately boring. The difference is that the $1 and $20 group are being asked to essentially lie to the next person that comes in. So in the $1 and the $20 condition, what happens is they go out there in the waiting room, and there is another participant waiting. It's actually not another participant, it's a confederate of the experimenter, but the participants didn't know that. And so the $1 and $20 group, most of those people did what the experimenter asked them, which is say that the task was really interesting. Okay. So the $1 group goes out there one-on-one, and they're like, yeah, it was really fun. It was good. I learned a lot, and did their thing. $20 group, yeah, it was really fun. I learned a lot. It was interesting. Okay. So after they do that, they are given the interview that the control group got. And as part of that interview, the question is, how fun do you think the task was, or how enjoyable was the task? So what do you think the results would be? Which group, the $1 group or the $20 group, is going to think that the task was more enjoyable? Well, very surprisingly, the $1 group, that $1 group actually found the task in their rankings of how they scored it. They scored it as more enjoyable than did the $20 group or the control group. The control group thought that it was not interesting. The $20 group thought that it was not interesting. But the $1 group had somewhat positive ratings for it. What happened? So for everybody in the experiment, we have one thing that we know is the baseline that's true. Everyone has a feeling and thought that they had an experience of a boring task. It was legitimately boring. There it is. The difference is the $1 and $20 conditions, they behave in a way that's opposing to that boring task. So for the $20 group and the $1 group, they both essentially lie and say that the task was fun. So they behave in a way, they have this behavior that's part of the package of what's going on in their life right now, of what they're trying to understand. They have a feeling and a thought that the task was boring, but they just watched themselves tell someone else that the task was fun. So when those places are not compatible and you have these two thoughts now, you have, I really thought that the task was boring. I just told someone else that it wasn't boring. Like these two things are now part of my head, of me trying to understand why I've done what I've done, right? They're in my social cognition. My social cognition's at war with itself. For the $20 group, you know how they resolve that tension? They know that the tension exists between what they feel and what they just did. But the $20 group goes, oh, you know what? $20. $20 explains why I did that. So the $20 is sufficient justification to justify the difference between their feelings and their actions. $20 is enough to explain it away, therefore reducing the dissonance or the discomfort from it. Those $20 people have no problem ranking the task as boring when they're asked about it later. They lied about it for $20. It explains it away. It justifies it away. But the $1 group has a harder time making this dissonance go away. In the $1 group, they have a boring task, and then they also have lied about the task, but they've lied about it for $1. $1 is insufficient justification to explain away the dissonance between those places. So what do? Well, anytime you have a dissonance between what you've just done and what you feel or think about something, something's got to give. You've either got to change your attitude or change your behavior, right? So in the case of the $1 group, they changed their attitude towards the task. In order to make the dissonance go away, because the $1 wasn't enough to make it go away, to make it be justified, the $1 group changes their attitude towards how they felt about the task, ranking it as more fun than they actually first thought. And that's a very classic explanation of how people resolve dissonance. They either change their behaviors to match their feelings and thoughts about something, or they will change their feelings and thoughts to match or explain how they've behaved, to justify how they've behaved. And that dissonance, you guys, that cognitive dissonance, is a very inherently human thing. All of us experience lots of places where the complexity of how we feel, how we think, and how we behave are not always perfectly in line with one another. That's normal. Now, we don't like discussing that it's normal because it makes us feel dissonant. We like being people that are consistent. We like it within ourselves, like we like to be consistent within ourselves intrapersonally. But we especially like to be consistent across one another or interpersonally. Like there's almost nothing worse than being called a hypocrite, right? Like, oh, that's so hypocritical of her that she believes this but then behaves this way. Ouch, right? So we have both intrapersonal and interpersonal pressure to be consistent. What no one ever really talks about authentically is that being a human is hard affectively, behaviorally, and cognitively, it's not easy. And people are not consistent robots. You can feel one way but behave another. It happens all the time. It's what you do to sort of make sense of it, to explain it, that determines what you do with that dissonance. Another way that behaviors sometimes connect with attitudes is through something called self-perception theory. Self-perception theory is from Daryl Bem, and the idea here is that we look at our own behavior to explain our attitudes. So we will sometimes decide how we feel about something based on how we've behaved towards something, especially when our attitude is unclear. So what's an example of looking to your behaviors? Well, you might be like, well, I must love him. He's been my boyfriend for 2 years. Right? Right? Where I'm looking at my past behavior to explain or inform how I should feel or what my attitude should be. Another example might be like, well, I've done this major for 3 years. I guess I really love it. I've obviously put 3 years of effort into it. I guess I really care and I really want to do that in my life, right? You're almost perceiving yourself from the outside. You're like, well, if somebody put that much time into that, they must really like it, right? Self-perception theory shows up the most, and we do this self-perception process of looking at our behaviors to explain our attitudes, especially when those attitudes are somewhat ambiguous or uncertain or unclear. It's like we're using the behavior as data to prove how we should feel and think. So both cognitive dissonance and self-perception can explain that connection between behaviors and attitudes, and they do it in slightly different ways. So for cognitive dissonance, the underlying motive has to do with striving for consistency. It's the discomfort that we feel from being inconsistent that leads us to try to either change our attitude or our behavior or do something to make the situation feel more consistent. So in cognitive dissonance, there's a dissonance or a mismatch somewhere between attitudes and behaviors and the thoughts of those things. And I've either got to change my feeling on something, my thought on something, or my behavior towards something. Something's got to give. In self-perception, maybe I'm not entirely sure about how I feel or think, but I'm watching my own behaviors, and over time, those behaviors are informing how I feel and think. So between these two theories, it's not like one's right or wrong. It's that in the human experience, some of your behaviors might be explained by one, and some of your behaviors might be explained by another. Social psychology, as you remember, has to do with social thinking, which is social cognition, social influence, and social relationships. Let's move forward now to social influence. So social influence has to do with persuasive power. How do we influence one another? Now, influence is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So I could have positive influence. A good example would be like a really good teacher. A good teacher takes you from where you're at and what you know and influences you in behaving and thinking and developing and learning new things, has influenced you to know that material more. So on the good end, influence could be something like education. On the bad end of social influence, you could have stuff like peer pressure or manipulation, seduction, propaganda. And since we're social creatures, we are able to be influenced. Chapter 9 talks all about the influence of caregivers. And you guys have friends and family. You know how important they are and how influential they are to your life. And you also know how influential you are to your friends and family as well. We have an impact on one another. So let's talk about some of the persuasive elements that are involved in social influence. Hovland, Janis, and Kelly in the 1950s have allowed us to sort of see the main elements of persuasive communications. So the 4 elements are the communicator, the medium, the target, and the message. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. So the communicator is the who. Who is the person that is selling the product? Now, a communication is more effective and more influential if the communicator is credible. And credibility has to do with the person being seen as trustworthy and an expert in their field or task. Now, they don't actually have to be an expert, but if they're perceived as an expert, then that is part of the communication, the influential communication. So in toothpaste commercials, where there's the dentist, the quote unquote dentist, he's wearing the sort of dental garb and the white coat and smiling, and he's in the dental office. You know, those are actors. Those are not like actual dentists, right? But the communication comes across. It comes across as credible because we kind of see that guy is trustworthy. He's smiling and he looks like a dentist. So he must know what he's talking about, right? So credibility has to do with our perceptions of the communicator being trustworthy and having expertise in their topic. Other elements of the communicator that are important are their attractiveness, their charisma, their likability, and their similarity to you, in such a way as attractive, charismatic, likable people, especially people that are trying to connect with you on similarities, are often going to be more persuasive because you have something to connect with, that's similarity. You have something that is warm and fuzzy, that's the likability, it feels good. And you have something pretty or something attractive, something that you like, that you have a halo around. And those things can be very influential. Another element of persuasive communications has to do with the medium or how the message, how that communication is sent over to you. Now I have television versus print, but yeah, let's think of like television versus Instagram versus face-to-face versus a newspaper versus a video online. Like there's different mediums, right? In general, things that are closer to you and more personal to you are often more effective and more influential. So for example, when you are actually in the car dealership, you're physically there, and the salesperson is making the pitch directly to you, that can be more influential than just an ad, a car ad that's on the TV. So the more personal the medium is, the more alluring and engaging and close up front it is, the more influential it can be. Is it word of mouth or is it an Instagram ad? Is it a lecture online or is it a lecture in person? Is it a television ad at a commercial break? Or is it an advertisement in the magazine that you're flipping through? The more engaging, the more attention getting, the more it has your focus, the more influential it'll be. And that engagement factor is part of the reason that face-to-face is more influential, because face-to-face tends to be more engaging. It's a little bit harder to just go to the next thing. In a magazine, you could flip the page quickly. Like nobody's holding you like, okay, you have to be on this page for 5 minutes, so take in all the information. But if we're face to face, it's a little bit hard to just scroll away from me, right? Or flip the page on me or change the channel on me. If we're face to face, you actually, because of social pressure, have to be a little bit more engaged. And the more engaged you are, the more influenced you could be. Another element of persuasion has to do with the target. And so the target has to do with, you have your communicator that's sending the message by a medium some way from them over to you. You are the target of the message. Okay? So the target of the message has to do with the audience that the message is being sent to. And there are different elements about target audiences. There could be age, pre-existing attitude, the strength of their feeling towards something at a time. So I'll give you an example. So I have a life that involves teaching different groups of people. I teach at a junior college very close to my house. It's a lower income area. We're doing the best that we can. So I teach that group of students. I teach you guys. And I also teach foster parents to be the people that are adults that want to have foster kids or adoptive kids. So I have 3 different audiences, right? I have 3 very different groups of people that I have to communicate with and hopefully influence in different ways by education. By influence, I mean I want to teach all 3 of these groups some concepts. Now, all 3 of these groups are very different in their average age, in their pre-existing attitudes, in their dynamics and ideas and motivation levels and why they're there. So a good communicator would know their audience, essentially. Well, if I'm doing a foster parent training, I might talk about the Myers-Briggs not on a scientific level. I might not go on and on about reliability, validity, the connection with the Big Five, I might not go into all those concepts. I might use that Myers-Briggs as just a fun little activity to get us talking about what it is to work with other people. Because when you have a foster kid, you're going to have to work with a lot of different people. And here it is. And so I'm sort of applying it to what they're about to do. That's why they're an audience. That's why they're in the room with me. They want to learn and want to be able to take care of kids that are in a rough season of their life, and they want to do a good job at it. So they're not there to learn about the Myers-Briggs or empirical psychology. They're there to be better parents. So as a communicator, I have to adjust what I'm doing. With you guys, I want you guys walking away from class with a well-rounded understanding of the main, very complicated, very amazing concepts in psychology. If you ever thought that it was a soft or easy science, I want you to leave this class understanding that it is beautiful and difficult and complex and still growing as a field, that it tries really hard to be precise because it wants to know the truth of why we do what we do. People within the ages of 18 to 25, that age bracket is often at the very center of advertisers and marketers and persuasive communicators trying to get that age bracket to go in the direction of their persuasive attempts. Your age bracket, the 18 to 25 age bracket, if a brand or a voting philosophy or an idea can capture you now, you are more likely to continue your life paying and voting and believing in those things. So you're at an age where marketers and influential people are trying to get your time. They're trying to get your affiliation. Because if they can get your affiliation now at 19, then they can still have the checks rolling in when you're 65 and you're still buying the thing, right? So yeah, if you feel like you're getting just bombarded by everything at all times, you are actually. Your age bracket is a target age bracket for persuasive communications. And this is one reason why you should know your science and know your psychological science really well, because you want to be able to tell the difference between a truthful campaign and a manipulative one. And the very last persuasive element has to do with the message itself. And so we talked about the communicator. That's the one that's giving the message. That's the who. We talked about the medium. That's the how, right? We talked about the audience or the to whom, right? And now let's talk about the message or the what. So what is being sold here? Well, in regard to the conveyance of a message, There are two primary routes of message communication. You either go the central route or the peripheral route. So the central route has to do with reasonable, logical, factual, and rational efforts to communicate facts and data and specifics about a situation. So a central route persuasion would be stuff like this. Here's the statistics on this. Here's the consequences of this. Here's the strengths of this. Here's the price point of this. Here's the weaknesses of this. Here is a testimonial from somebody that liked it. Here's a testimonial from someone that didn't like it. Here are the facts. So a central route persuasion has to do with facts. And central route persuasions are more persuasive when the audience, the one that's taking in that message, is motivated, focused, and not distracted. So a logical argument is more persuasive when it makes sense to you, when you're paying attention, motivated to learn, open to learn, and not distracted by other things. Now, we don't always make decisions, though, or take in information when we're motivated, right? There's plenty of times that information comes our way and we're distracted or not listening or not feeling it, right? The health psychology literature has shown for years that oftentimes patients that have a doctor give them recommendations, they leave the doctor's office and don't remember exactly or sort of can't remember the details of what the doctor told them. It's not that they weren't motivated, it's that they were kind of like distracted and overwhelmed and thinking about all these other things when the doctor was trying to talk to them. A lot of times because their emotions are kind of getting in the way. So central route persuasions are more effective when you have an audience that is ready for the information, motivated and focused, and not distracted. But once emotions get involved, and distraction might get involved, and feelings are sort of swirling around, the other persuasive route is called the peripheral route. And peripheral means like sort of, we're getting to you by the sides. We're kind of going around about. We're being persuasive in a sort of like, whoop, we're going to sneak around the side. So a peripheral persuasion often evokes your emotions and your feelings and, ooh, look over here. This is shiny. This is so fun. Oh, it's a song that you really like. You love this song. Like flashing lights, beautiful people, a song that's playing that's your total favorite. Oh, there's your favorite celebrity. Oh, the peripheral route has to do with evoking sort of an emotional response from you. And they're using peripheral items like celebrities or beauty or beautiful pictures or songs or similarity. They're using other elements other than the facts of the product or the facts of the elements. They're using the fun stuff and the feel-good stuff as a way to get you to say yes or to get you to purchase the item or get your affiliation there. People are more likely to be persuaded by peripheral route persuasions when they are distracted or in need of sort of like emotional certainty, when they're sort of uncertain and not very motivated for a lecture, but they just sort of want to feel good. So what are some examples of persuasive processes? Well, there are two types of techniques that are persuasive processes that I want to give you an example for. There's something called the foot in the door technique, and there's also something called the door in the face technique. So the foot in the door technique comes from salesmen that back in the day would go door to door, knocking on doors, asking the person at home to make a purchase. And they would knock on the door, and when the person in the home would open the door, they would put their foot in the door as a way of sort of like keeping the person in the house from shutting the door. So it's like, listen, you got to give me a second, and I'm sort of creating a space. Yes, I have my foot in the door with you. Now, the foot in the door technique has to do with getting a person to say yes to a very small request and getting the foot in the door. That's the first sort of like yes, opening the door and the foot's in the door. That's a yes. And after the foot's in the door, after you've said yes to one thing, I become more likely to say yes to the next request, which involves coming in to see some of the things that he's selling, and I become even more likely to say yes to whatever he's selling because I've already said yes to one small thing. So when the next bigger thing comes in, it's harder for me to say no to it. So your friend says, "Can you help me with something?" And you say yes, right? Like your friends. And you're like, "Yes, of course." And then they're like, "Hey, I need to drive somewhere for 4 days. And I know you have a final, I know you have other stuff, but you've already said yes to one thing, and then it's going to involve 4 days, $1,000, all your time. You're going to miss some of your tests." It's like, uh-oh, right? The application here, you guys, is be very careful with the things that you say yes to. People like to say yes. Our brain likes to say yes to other people. It makes other people and us feel good. We feel good because we've been a good friend, or we've been a helpful person, or we've been nice, and that feels good. Yay. But the problem is that if you say yes to something before you know the full weight and full measure and full consequence of it, you're not really stewarding or taking care of your yes. What the research shows us here is that be careful with your first yes. If someone asks you something, you need to get in the habit of asking questions. What will it involve? Hey girl, give me a second. You have to guard the first yes, because psychologically, once you've said yes to someone, it becomes harder and harder to say no to them. Now, the opposite is also true. The opposite has to do with the door in the face technique. And the door in the face is, I know it sounds totally opposite to the foot in the door, and you're like, how can they both be true? But they are. In the door in the face technique, a salesman is actually trying to get you to say no, a very strong no the first time, to slam the door in your face. So the first request is something really huge. Would you like to buy a new car? No. Boom. Okay. You've said no. You've closed down the door. They've made a request of you. It's big. It's a really big request. They've led with a huge, very costly ask. But here's what's crazy. When they ask you for $5 afterwards for a donation for the car's Thanksgiving giveaway or something, the difference between the cost of a car and $5 lets you say yes. So when I'm able to resolve my dissonance of saying no, I feel a little guilty, I feel a little bad, was I too mean, did I slam the door too hard? When the person asks me this smaller request, do you know that I'm more likely to say yes now? They've essentially manipulated out of me the second yes, because they intended for me to say no. And in saying no, I felt dissonant. And because I felt dissonant, I was in a place of wanting to feel more consistent. And by the time they asked me for the $5, that was something that I was ready and yes, of course, I wanted to say yes to. So in either direction, we have our yes being manipulated, right? So be careful, guys. Be mindful of the psychological power of your yes. What you say yes to, what you agree to, has tremendous power in your current decisions and your future decisions. So before we end part 1 of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about how you resist persuasion. I want to give you strategies to inoculate yourself against people that want to persuade you in bad ways. I want your minds open to the good people and the safe people. I want you to think about a diversity of ideas. Hey, if you don't agree with somebody, I want you to have conversations with people. I want you to have experiences in classes and professors and with people that are diverse and rich to get different perspectives on life. That's awesome. That's the human experience. So I want you to be educated. And part of being educated is listening to different perspectives and different viewpoints, right? But what I don't want you to succumb to is manipulation or propaganda or things that might seduce or hurt you. So one of the ways that you resist negative effects of persuasion is that you just know who you are, know what you think, and know what you feel. Another way that you resist negative persuasion is by having your affect, cognition, and your behavior be integrated or as consistent as they can be. So you get in the habit of being consistent in your feeling, thinking, and behaving. You can resist persuasion by knowing what you believe and why you believe it. And you can resist persuasion even more by having dialogues with safe people that have different perspectives and going back and forth. Because as we talk about what we believe in a safe place, sometimes people have other arguments that come up, and it clarifies for you how you feel, how you think, and how you should behave. You also need some practice in inoculating yourself against negative persuasive attempts. People are better at resisting drugs or peer pressure or negative things that might hurt them. They're better at resisting those things if they have practiced saying no, if they have practiced essentially getting out of situations like that. So let's imagine I work with junior hires. Well, I would do a role play with them, right? Where I'd put them in groups and I'd give them roles to play, and one of them would be the bully that's pressuring the other one to smoke, and they would have to practice saying no. And if they take it seriously, actually I can strengthen them because I am giving them a weak version of the persuasive attempt. And what do I mean weak? I mean, it's a role play. It's not the real thing. So as they're sitting in junior high social science and we're doing this role play, the peer that they're talking to is supposed to push them. You got to do it. You're not cool if you don't do it. And what they have to do as the person that's role playing in this safe place is they have to come up with arguments. No, man, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't think it's cool. No. Well, as the bully keeps pressing on them, they have to themselves motivate different responses. They have to practice. They have to walk through the immunity of building up the strength to deal with the threat. Now, if they've done that, then their body and person is more able to later deal with a real threat because it's already gone through the immunity process of having the defenses in mind, and it has practiced those things. It knows what to do to say no. So what does this mean? This means that we don't just tell people just to say no and that's it. They have to know why they say no. They have to have arguments for saying no. They have to have coping strategies to get out of those situations. It's not enough to just tell a person to do the right thing. You have to train them and teach them what the right thing is. And as we end part 1 of this lecture, I want to return to this idea of your hero. Your hero has become a hero not just by saying no once or doing right once. They really had to go through it to get to that place of victory, right? So you don't resist negative persuasion just by having willpower one time. You have to go through the things. You have to go through the practice of doing the right things in the right way to get those muscles ready to be what they want to be, which is strong and brave and kind and courageous and smart. And that's what I think about all of you guys. You are kind and courageous and brave and smart. You're made for great things. Good job on finishing part 1 of this lecture. I'll catch you in part 2.